I will never forget the sound of those knocks on my door at 5 in the morning. It was one of those cold, still nights when the whole city seems to be holding its breath. When I looked at my phone and saw my CEO's name on the screen, I thought it had to be a work emergency. I was not prepared to see her standing outside my apartment, eyes red, shoulders slumped, soul clearly shattered. She had just finalized her divorce, but that was not the thing that truly froze my blood. What came after that confession, what she asked of me in that tiny living room, turned my life upside down. And back then, half asleep in my pajamas, I had no idea that my entire future was about to tilt off its axis. I had always been the assistant, the guy who made everything run smoothly without being noticed. From my corner desk, I watched my CEO the way people look at someone who belongs to another world entirely. She was the picture-perfect leader, sharp, elegant, married to a powerful man, always in control. To the outside world, she was a symbol of success, the kind of woman about whom people say, she has it all. I, on the other hand, was the invisible gear in the machine, working quietly in the background. What I did not know was that, behind that polished facade, her life was slowly collapsing, and that, of all people, she would choose my door as the place to knock when everything finally broke. If you want to know what she told me that morning and why it changed everything for both of us, if you want to understand how a nobody in the company ended up in the middle of a silent war for control, and how that dawn forced me to pick between comfort and courage, between fear and a sense of what is right, stay with me until the end of this story and listen carefully to every detail I am about to share. Because nothing that happened next was random, and every decision carried a price we had to pay. Before we dive in, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. And while you do that, ask yourself, what would you do if your CEO knocked at your door at 5 in the morning? Before that morning, my life was so predictable that I could have lived it on autopilot. I would wake up, drink a quick coffee while staring at the same gray building across the street. Then I'd squeeze into a crowded train, think about bills, deadlines, and arrive at the office early as usual. Inside the company, my name rarely came up in big conversations, but my work was everywhere. Emails organized, calendars updated, documents ready, crises handled before anyone saw them coming. I was the person quietly holding things together behind the scenes, without applause or recognition. And somewhere along the way, I had accepted that invisibility as part of who I was. My CEO lived on the opposite side of that spectrum. When she walked into the building, conversations softened and backs straightened almost automatically. Her clothes were always flawless, her hair perfectly styled, her expression focused and composed. She did not need to raise her voice to command the room. Her presence alone did that. Investors trusted her. The board depended on her. Competitors talked about her with a mix of fear and respect. For most people, she was the definition of untouchable, a woman who never stumbled, never cracked. And I was just the assistant who made sure the room was ready before she walked in. From my position, I saw things others did not, precisely because no one paid attention to me. I saw who lowered their gaze when she entered a tense meeting with the executive team. I noticed which director avoided her eyes after a call with her husband. I heard pieces of gossip in the break room about their luxurious lifestyle and perfect marriage. People talked about the big house, the cars, the magazine photos, the charity events. The story was always the same. She's lucky. She has everything. Power, money, love. Sitting alone with my lunch tray, I got used to swallowing that narrative along with my food. My personal life, compared to that sparkling image, felt painfully small. I had no partner, and my past relationships had quietly faded away without big dramatic endings. My weekends were filled with movies, takeout, and the quiet feeling that something was missing. Sometimes I wondered if anyone would ever look at me with the same admiration people had for her. Not out of fear or obligation, but with genuine respect and trust. But those thoughts always disappeared under spreadsheets, meeting reminders, and endless emails. The more the company grew, the smaller I felt inside that glass building. If someone had told me that the most powerful woman in that building would one day need me, that she would show up at my door alone, with her heart in pieces and her life in ruins, I would have laughed and said that sounded like the plot of a bad movie, not my reality. In my mind, she was immune to the kind of disasters that hit ordinary people. But life has a strange way of shattering our illusions when we least expect it, and the distance between her world and mine was about to shrink to a few steps in a narrow hallway, just before the quietest night of my life started making a lot of noise. It did not happen overnight. The perfect picture of her life started breaking in tiny, subtle ways. At first, they were the kind of details anyone could have dismissed without thinking twice. One morning, she walked into the most important meeting of the quarter a few minutes late. Her eyes, usually bright and razor-sharp, looked heavy, as if she had not slept at all. She brushed it off with a professional smile, but her hands shook slightly when she picked up her notes. No one said a word. Nobody dares to ask a CEO if she's okay, not in front of everyone. From my corner, I felt like I'd just seen the first hairline crack in a smooth, polished wall. As the weeks went by, those small cracks began to align into something more. Sometimes she would stand by the window before a key video call, staring at nothing for too long. She would press her lips together, inhale deeply, as if bracing herself for an invisible impact. One day, she repeated the same sentence twice in a presentation, something she never did. Another day, she dropped a pen on the floor and took longer than usual to pick it up. The directors ignored all of it, because it was easier to keep believing in the marble statue. But I, who lived watching every detail, knew that statue was starting to fracture. There is one scene I still replay in my head. We were in a big meeting about a critical contract that revolved around trust. While she spoke about loyalty in business, her voice trembled for a fraction of a second. She paused, drank some water, and continued as if nothing had happened. Yet, in that brief moment, her eyes revealed a sadness so deep it almost felt personal. No one mentioned it afterward. Everyone acted like it never happened. I couldn't forget it, because for that second it felt like she wasn't talking only about work. Rumors began to spread more intensely through the hallways, as they always do. Someone said they'd heard arguments through the walls of her office. Another claimed they had seen her leave the building late at night with swollen eyes. Someone else swore her husband had shown up at the company and the tension was unbearable. Half-truths, exaggerations, and inventions blended into one messy story. But under all of that, there was a reality no one dared to say aloud. Something was very wrong. Maybe the perfect marriage was just another product to be sold to the public. The last week before that, Dawn felt different, like a held breath. She missed 2 days in a row without a clear explanation, which was completely out of character. Official emails said she was dealing with urgent personal matters. Investors started asking quiet questions. Board members exchanged worried looks. In the break room, people lowered their voices whenever her name came up. At my desk, I checked the calendar over and over, searching for clues that weren't there. I didn't know the real answer was on its way to my apartment, not to my inbox. The night everything changed, I had gone to bed later than usual. I had brought work home, as always, and had stayed up staring at documents until my eyes burned. When I finally turned off the light, I felt like I was trapped in a wheel that never stopped spinning. I have no idea how long I slept before my phone started vibrating on the nightstand. Half blind, I reached for it and squinted at the illuminated screen. Her name stared back at me, cutting through the darkness like a knife. My heart jumped so hard I genuinely thought I might still be dreaming. I answered with a tired, shaky voice, trying to sound more awake than I was. I said her name, asked if something had happened at the company, if there was an emergency. On the other end, there was a silence that lasted just a second too long. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded hoarse, like someone who had been crying for hours. She didn't mention contracts, investors, or numbers. None of the usual vocabulary was there. She simply asked if I was home and if she could come over for a moment to talk. She didn't sound like a CEO giving orders. She sounded like someone barely holding on. My first reaction was confusion mixed with a cold wave of fear. I stared at the clock, then back at her name glowing on the screen, trying to make sense of it. Part of me wondered if she had dialed the wrong number by mistake. Another part remembered all the cracks I had been watching quietly for weeks. I asked gently if she wanted me to call someone else, a director, a lawyer, a friend. She said no, firmly but softly, and repeated that she wanted to talk to me. In that instant, I knew that if I said no, I would be abandoning someone on the edge. I agreed, even though my mind was still scrambling for logic. She told me she was already nearby, that she hadn't known where else to go. I felt a strange mix of honor and panic rising inside me. I threw off the blanket as if a fire alarm had gone off in my tiny apartment. I turned on all the lights at once and tried to clean the living room in 30 seconds. In the mirror, I saw a man with messy hair and dark circles who had no time to look presentable. Whether I liked it or not, that was the version of myself she was about to see. When the intercom buzzed, reality snapped into focus. The doorman calmly said her name, while my heart hammered in my chest. I confirmed she could come up, and, while I waited, my thoughts raced wildly. Had something exploded in the company? Had there been a scandal, a leak, a disaster? Was she there to ask me to do something illegal, dangerous, impossible to undo? Or was I about to become a witness to a personal collapse I couldn't stop? I had no answers, just the sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway. When I opened the door, for a moment I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me. The dim yellow light from the hallway made everything look raw and unfiltered. She was not wearing her usual immaculate suit or heels that echoed through the corridors. Instead, she had on simple pants, an oversized sweater, and a coat thrown on in a hurry. Her makeup, if there had been any, was gone, erased by tears and exhaustion. Her eyes were swollen, not from one hard moment, but from a long series of them. In one hand, she gripped a small suitcase, like someone who had left in a rush and didn't plan to go back. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in, feeling awkward and strangely exposed. She walked in slowly, looking around my small living room as if entering another universe. It was surreal to see someone so used to glass-walled boardrooms on my worn-out couch. I offered her water, coffee, tea, anything that would buy me a moment to steady myself. She accepted a glass of water and held it with both hands as if trying to warm them. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything she had not said yet. Eventually, she sat down and set the suitcase beside her. I stayed standing for a second, unsure if I should speak first. When she finally lifted her eyes, there was a strange blend of fragility and resolve in them. She was not the commanding executive who walked through the office with unshakable confidence. She was a woman who had reached the limit of what she could carry alone. She cleared her throat, drew a shaky breath, as if preparing to jump off a ledge. Then she said it. I just signed my divorce papers. I didn't know how to respond. This was a version of her I had never imagined. The glossy image of her perfect marriage shattered in my mind like glass. I asked carefully if she was sure she wanted to talk about something so personal with me. She nodded, a faint, bitter smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She said she didn't need another executive's opinion or a lawyer's calculation. She needed someone who would simply listen, someone who had nothing to gain from her pain. And, to my surprise, she said she had been watching me for a long time. That alone would have been enough to change the way I saw myself in the company. But what came after went far beyond a late-night confession about a broken marriage. Her divorce wasn't just a matter of love gone wrong. It was a declaration of war. Her ex-husband was not planning to let go without dragging her and the company through the mud. He had connections, leverage, and people inside the organization willing to move pieces for him. And for reasons I still didn't fully grasp, she had come to pull me into that storm too. Not as a victim, but as an accomplice in something she had only begun to reveal. She started speaking slowly, as if every memory had sharp edges that might cut her on the way out. She told me that the marriage everyone praised had been a carefully staged performance for years. While magazines labeled them a power couple, at home things were nothing like the photos. Her husband, also well-connected in the corporate world, had mastered the art of appearances. In public, he was charming and supportive, the perfect partner standing proudly at her side. In private, he controlled her with subtle cruelty, strategic criticism, and constant emotional pressure. He never left visible marks, but he hollowed her out from the inside. At first, she explained, she tried to justify the outbursts and harsh words. She told herself it was stress, the weight of two demanding careers colliding. She forgave the first insults, the first nights of slammed doors and cold silence. But over time, apologies vanished, and respect disappeared from their conversations. He started using her career, and especially the company, as weapons in their arguments. He would remind her of the doors he had opened, the favors he had called in for her. And then he hinted that he could close those doors just as easily. When she finally gathered the courage to ask for a divorce, it wasn't on impulse. She had quietly documented everything, talked to lawyers under the radar, prepared legal ground. Even so, she knew he would not walk away gracefully. His pride would not allow it. The night before she came to my apartment, the final fight had been nuclear. He made it clear that if she left, he wouldn't just go after her personally. He would come for her through the company, turning her greatest achievement into a battlefield. He claimed he had people on the inside ready to pull strings at his command. He threatened to push the narrative that she had lost control after the divorce, that she was unstable, emotional, no longer fit to lead. He knew how quickly a story like that could spread in their world. All he needed was a few wrong decisions, a few mistakes in the right places. And from the outside, it would look like she was simply crumbling under pressure. He would ruin her reputation while pretending to be concerned about the company. It was vicious, cold, and terrifyingly logical. As she spoke, I felt anger boiling in my chest for a man I had never even met. It wasn't just the injustice. It was the calculated way he had turned her entire life into leverage. She admitted that there had been many times she wanted to walk away sooner. But every time, she thought about the people who worked under her, the projects at stake. If a scandal exploded at the wrong moment, hundreds of employees could pay the price. He knew that, too, and that's why he always used the company as a leash around her neck. And now, by asking for a divorce, she had finally yanked at that leash. By the time she finished that part of the story, I felt like someone had taken off my blindfold. The woman I thought had everything under control had been fighting for her sanity in silence. The company I thought I knew had been a playground for invisible power games. That visit at 5 in the morning was no random breakdown. It was a turning point. She wasn't just running from a bad marriage. She was trying to keep a war from spilling into the entire company. And somehow, whether I liked it or not, I was now part of that equation. The only thing I didn't understand yet was why she needed me specifically. When she finished, the room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical. I was still holding my empty glass, fingers tense around it, as if letting go would break the moment. She rested her elbows on her knees, clasped her hands, and lowered her head for a few seconds. It was like she was carefully weighing each word before offering it to me. Then she looked up, and for the first time, there were no titles or roles between us. In her eyes, I didn't see my boss. I saw a human being who had reached her limit. And only then did she tell me why, of all people, she had decided to come to me. She said she had been watching how I handled things no one else wanted to deal with. How I showed up early, stayed late, and still never begged for credit. She had noticed how I quietly protected weaker colleagues without turning it into a performance. In a world where everyone fought to be seen, she said I was one of the few who just tried to do the right thing. That was why, when everything collapsed, she hadn't wanted another executive or a partner. She wanted someone who had no hidden agenda, whose loyalty did not depend on money or status. And somehow, she believed that person was me. Then she shifted from emotions to something far more dangerous. She explained that her ex-husband would not accept losing his grip without a fight. He still had access, influence, and allies nestled in the upper levels of the company. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about turning the company into a tool to punish her. Some contracts already smelled like sabotage, some decisions like traps carefully laid out. If she confronted anyone directly, they would say she was paranoid, driven by personal drama. And in their world, that alone could be enough to push her out. That was why she needed someone invisible. That was the word she used. Someone who moved through the company unnoticed, but who saw everything from the ground up. Someone who knew the flows of emails, meetings, and documents better than most managers. Someone no one would consider a threat, precisely because they were so ordinary. In her mind, that person was me, the assistant people barely registered when they walked past. And her request, when it finally came, landed like a thunderclap in that small room. "I need you to help me protect this company from my ex-husband," she said. My first instinct was to laugh nervously, just to release the pressure. But there was no room for laughter in that moment. Only the roar of my own heartbeat in my ears. Images flashed through my mind, getting fired, sued, dragged into a scandal I couldn't survive. I asked her if she truly understood what she was asking of me. She nodded, calm on the surface, though her hands betrayed how afraid she really was. She said she wouldn't blame me if I refused, that she knew it was unfair to put me in that position. But then she added one sentence that I still remember word for word. If no one helped her, many more people would fall with her. It took me a long, silent moment to answer. Inside, two versions of myself were tearing each other apart. One wanted to run, to stay small and safe, to keep paying rent and minding my own business. The other one, quieter but stubborn, whispered that pretending I hadn't heard any of this would be worse. All the things she had just told me could not be unheard or forgotten. She didn't push, didn't try to bribe or manipulate me. She simply waited. And somehow, her patience made my choice heavier, not lighter. I told her I was scared, that I was not a brave person by nature. I said I had never done anything remotely close to what she was asking. I admitted I had no idea how I would react if powerful people turned their anger toward me. But I also said that walking away and pretending nothing was happening would not let me sleep at night. That now that I knew how her ex-husband had been using the company and her life like toys, I couldn't unsee it. Almost without realizing it, I heard myself say the words, "I'll help you." The look of relief on her face was unlike anything I'd ever seen at the office. Then she began outlining the skeleton of her plan. We needed to figure out exactly where the leaks were before making any moves. Who was leaking information, which contracts were being twisted, and which decisions felt engineered to fail. My role would be to pay unusual attention to emails, calendars, and subtle shifts in routines. Not hacking, not breaking any laws, just looking at what was already there with new eyes. She would start repositioning herself quietly in the board, building alliances without revealing everything. Together, we would build a silent map of loyalties and betrayals. We agreed that our most sensitive conversations would never happen through company channels. In the office, she would go back to being her usual composed, distant self. Our emails would be short, objective, and boring to anyone who read them. Only outside, on quiet walks, in anonymous cafes, would we connect the dots. Any suspicious document would be examined twice, maybe 3 times, before being filed away. Every move we made had to look like routine, not like an investigation. The only proof of our alliance would be the trust we had sealed in that early morning visit. By the end of that conversation, I realized I was stepping into a world I didn't really understand. Suddenly, it wasn't just schedules and reminders. It was strategy, power, and hidden agendas. There were people smiling in meetings while sharpening knives behind closed doors. And I, who had always preferred clear, simple tasks, was agreeing to something messy and dangerous. Before she left, she thanked me with a sincerity I had never seen from her in a professional setting. She didn't promise victory, just that she would not forget what I was risking for her. I closed the door after she walked out and knew, in my gut, that I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The days that followed felt like waking up in the same place, but in a different reality. The lobby, the elevators, the glass walls, everything looked the same on the surface. But now, every hallway had a hidden question behind it. I watched directors with a different kind of attention, who avoided her office, who was too eager, who lingered in phone calls, who shut their laptops too quickly when someone walked by, who seemed nervous leaving certain meetings where her name had come up. The company had turned into a live map of possibilities and suspicions. Our communication had to evolve into something almost choreographed. Inside the office, she returned to being the unshakable CO everyone expected. Her instructions came through short emails, calendar invites, anonymous meeting notes. Only in tiny gestures, an extra second of eye contact, a small nod, could I feel the shared secret. The real updates happened after hours, outside, where no one could casually overhear us. A walk around the block, a quick meeting in a quiet coffee shop, a brief talk standing by a window. We were building something no one else knew existed. Slowly, I started noticing patterns I'd never paid attention to before. A contract forwarded to someone who had no practical reason to be copied on it. A meeting added and then quietly erased from the calendar with no explanation. Internal messages using phrases I had only ever heard from people close to her ex-husband. Budget shifts that magically favored projects tied to companies friendly with him. Each isolated incident could be written off as coincidence or human error. Together, they began to look like a strategy. The more I saw, the more exposed I felt. If anyone realized how closely I was watching certain things, they might start watching me too. I tried to keep my routine intact. Same coffee, same desk, same polite small talk. But part of my mind was always elsewhere, analyzing, connecting, questioning. At the same time, my bond with her deepened in a way that couldn't be labeled. We were not friends, not exactly, and not just boss and employee anymore. We were two people tied together by a secret decision made before sunrise. Nights grew longer and heavier. Some evenings, I would sit in my living room replaying every interaction from the day. Did I ask too many questions in that meeting? Did someone notice the way I looked at that spreadsheet? Was that joke in the hallway just a joke or a test? There were moments when I wanted nothing more than to go back to being invisible. But then I remembered her standing at my door with that suitcase and those exhausted eyes. And I knew that, whether I liked it or not, I had already stepped into the story. The point of no return arrived faster than either of us expected. A sequence of suspicious moves began to line up like dominoes. A key project was nearly sabotaged by a mistake in a vital clause of the contract. One director, known for his closeness to her ex-husband, defended that mistake too aggressively. The emails we dug up showed off-the-record conversations about the same contract. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was intentional and dangerous. If we did nothing, the fallout could be devastating for the company and for her. She gathered everything we had compiled over those tense weeks. Printed emails, cross-checked reports, meeting logs, all woven into a bigger picture. She called for an extraordinary board meeting under the guise of a risk assessment review. We knew some of the people at that table had ties to her ex-husband, whether they'd admit it or not. Others were walking in blind, unaware of what was brewing under their feet. Our goal wasn't to point fingers blindly, but to display evidence no one could ignore. My job was to prepare the flow of documents and support her silently from the shadows. The air in the boardroom that day was almost electric. She walked in with a calm that felt different from her usual professional mask. It wasn't arrogance. It was the steadiness of someone who has decided not to back down. She started with numbers, charts, risk indicators, nothing unusual at first. Then, little by little, she began layering in the odd decisions, the flawed contracts, the sudden changes. You could see discomfort spreading across the table as the pattern emerged. When she finally linked those moves to the network around her ex-husband, the room shifted. What followed was a storm of reactions. One director tried to dismiss everything as coincidental, grasping at technicalities. Another, clearly taken off guard, insisted on a thorough investigation. She didn't raise her voice or threaten anyone. She simply refused to be talked over. It was as if she were holding up a mirror and making everyone look at what they'd preferred not to see. From my place at the back of the room, I absorbed every flinch, every defensive comment, every guilty silence. For the first time, people were seeing the cracks we had mapped in secret. When her ex-husband learned about the meeting, he reacted exactly as she had predicted. There were calls, messages, veiled threats, attempts to paint her as irrational. A leak to the press tried to frame her as a CEO spiraling out of control after a messy divorce. But this time, she wasn't alone or unprepared. She already had her own narrative backed by evidence and internal support. Some people who had stayed quiet began, cautiously, to distance themselves from his side. The balance of power had shifted, even if the war was not entirely over. The outcome wasn't some neat, fairy tale victory, but it was a turning point. Several people involved in the suspicious moves were suspended or formally investigated. The board imposed strict limits on external influence over major decisions. The story about her being unstable lost its weight in the face of documented facts. Her ex-husband, though still present in the background, no longer pulled strings so easily. She finally had room to act without constantly checking over her shoulder. And slowly, the company began to close the wounds no one had admitted were there. For me, there was no going back to the old version of my life. I could no longer pretend to be just the assistant who booked rooms and sent reminders. She made sure that, quietly but clearly, the right people knew what I had done. She didn't expose every detail, but she spoke of my reliability, my attention, my discretion. Soon after, I was invited into a new role with more responsibility and access. I went from setting up the table for meetings to actually having a seat at it. Whether I liked it or not, my career had taken a sharp turn. On a personal level, I changed in ways that are harder to describe. I stopped seeing myself as someone permanently stuck in the background. I realized that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The more I thought about everything we had risked, the more I understood how easy it would have been to say no. To mute the phone that night, roll over, and go back to sleep. To spend the rest of my life wondering why my opportunities never came. Instead, I had opened the door and stepped into something bigger than me. My relationship with her became something people on the outside would never fully understand. Officially, she was still my CEO, and I was still part of her staff. There were hierarchies, protocols, professional distance we both respected. But underneath that, there was a layer of trust that doesn't show up on any org chart. We shared knowledge of things that would never make it into reports or newsletters. Sometimes, one look exchanged across a meeting room was enough to say, "We remember." We didn't have to talk about that dawn every day for its echo to remain. If you're waiting for me to label exactly what we became to each other, I won't. Some things belong only to the people who live them, not to simple definitions. What I can say is that I never looked at her the same way again, as some distant, flawless figure. And she never looked at me again as just a replaceable name in the system. We were two people who had met at the most fragile point of what looked like a solid life. And because of a decision made at 5 in the morning, both of our realities flipped. The rest, what didn't make it into public view, remains part of a mystery I'm not planning to solve here. When I think back to those knocks on my door, I still feel my chest tighten. If someone had told me that opening it would drag me into power games, fear, and difficult choices, I wouldn't have believed them. But life doesn't always ask if we're ready before it hands us a crossroads. What started as a desperate visit from a newly divorced woman became a hidden war inside the company. And somehow, it also became the opportunity one never would have had the courage to ask for. Now I understand something important. We don't always get to choose when our defining moment arrives. Sometimes, it's a name lighting up your phone in the middle of the night. Sometimes, it's a truth you can't ignore once you've heard it. I could have chosen safety, silence, and a quiet life in the background. Instead, I chose to get involved, even trembling, and that choice turned my entire life upside down. So let me turn this question to you. If your boss, your leader, your untouchable figure showed up at your door at 5 a.m., if they confessed something that shattered everything you thought you knew, what would you do? Would you protect your peace and look away, or risk your comfort to stand by what feels right? Tell me in the comments which side of this story you see yourself on. And if you want more real, emotional stories about invisible decisions that change everything, subscribe to the channel right now, leave your like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who might be fighting a silent battle and needs to hear it. Because sooner or later, we all face a moment that forces us to decide who we really are. And the next door life knocks on might be yours. See you in the next story.